Apparently I'm extremely popular.
So I really meant that. What I said is that we only know we only know each other a few months, and Bill and I feel like we know each other all our lives because we have parallel interests, and we grew up in New York City, and we know a lot about New York City. I noticed you, not to put you on the spot, I noticed that when I was talking about stop and frisk, you had a nod of acknowledgement and you understand about those things as well and how people feel about it, especially if they're the ones being stopped and frisked. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that.
Right.
We're here to talk about what Cristina does.
What am I doing here? Anthony, I just want to make sure I'm frisking you now.
Yeah, go right ahead.
That's what he likes.
I'm not in any danger. I don't want to be in any danger. Okay.
Stop and frisk.
My buddy Anthony is unarmed. I feel very safe now, and I've got Bill to protect me.
Not at all. Not even a little bit.
You guys are like my brothers. It's such a pleasure to be here.
We know that Cristina does a lot of work for you. And she was
yes.
explaining to us recently about that she also designs web pages, and she also assists you in some of your work that you do. And I want to talk about several things, but first, the first thing I want to talk about, I didn't get an opportunity in the last show. I want to understand better. You teach the Meisner technique.
I teach Meisner technique, scene study, cold reading, audition technique, and on camera.
Okay, so now let's start at the beginning. What is, for those of us who don't understand, what is the Meisner technique?
The Meisner technique was devised by Sanford Meisner, who was one of the original members of the group theater. And what Sandy wanted to do, his goal was to try and take the intellectual thought process out of the actor's work. Because the last place on earth an actor wants to be or needs to be is in his head. So what Meisner wanted to do was he wanted to tap into the actor's instincts, to get to the impulses, so that actors would have a living experience. So that when they got to the point where they were playing scenes, they had been taught and retaught, in a sense, how important it was to listen and respond from a truthful point of view without thinking about it, just like we do in life. In life, we never think about it. You go over to your friend Bill, you see him sitting in a cafe, he looks sad. You walk up to him and say, "Bill, what's the matter?" He hasn't said a word. How do you know something is the matter? You don't. But you're picking up something from your friend that's touching something in you that causes you to have that response.
Intuitively.
Intuitively, right. What Meisner called the instincts, the actor's instincts. So what Sanford Meisner did was, he devised a series of repetition exercises where the actors initially sit opposite one another and they just repeat verbatim something to the effect of, "I like your shirt, I like your shirt, I like your shirt, I like your shirt." Now, to people unfamiliar with the Meisner technique, that may sound ridiculous. Like, what is that? How is that possibly going to make me a better actor? But what you're teaching the actor from ground zero is to listen and repeat, listen and repeat. And by doing that in a mechanical way in the earliest stages, you're removing thought from your work. And once you remove intellectual thought from the work, what are you left with? Impulse. Just like in life, we all know people that, you probably have them in your life, I've had them in my life, and maybe I've done the same thing in my life, where we say, "What's the matter with that guy? Doesn't he ever think before he speaks?"
Yes, I've met people like that.
Well,
we may even have mutual opinions. No names, please. No names.
No names.
I haven't paid the insurance.
We won't mention their names. But what we're talking about there, in a sense, is there are people with no filter.
Yes.
Well, in our everyday lives, that's not necessarily a plus. Right?
It's definitely a negative in society.
In society, it's a negative. You know, nobody asked you what you thought about that person that made
Just hold that
a
thought a
couple of
minute.
pounds.
Recently, very recently, I had a conversation with someone who had offended another friend of mine. And in a conversation with her, she said, "Well, I told the truth." And I said to her, I said, sometimes a person would prefer someone they can share a confidence with. And it looked like I hit her with a bat.
Mm-hmm.
Her whole face like that. I mean, you would have here like that.
Right.
And really, you know, it never occurred to her. She had been standing behind the so-called truth, but when truth is offensive and cruel and rude, maybe that's not the first approach.
Not in civilization, not in a civilized society, but that's what makes acting in a sense so difficult, because what you're doing to people who have been civilized is they get into the classroom and they say, okay, now for the purposes of what you need to do as an actor, you have to throw everything away that you learned in the outside world. You have to turn it inside out, and now what we're demanding of you is to tell the truth from your gut. So acting, as we say, is from the waist down, not from the neck up.
So let me ask you this: when you were repeating in this exercise, is there also, in that process of repeating, that each time you say that line differently?
It happens. That's the whole point, right?
We may say, I may say to you, "I like you," or I can say, "I like you."
Exactly.
There's many ways to say the exact same word, and your expression and your demeanor and your conduct, and if it's visual, your body language.
Right. You're talking about what you're describing here now is what they call the third stage of the repetition exercises, where people begin to respond from their own truthful point of view.
Right.
So what we're getting them to do is not give a predetermined response, which would be the equivalent of a line reading, let's say.
Script or a
Right, right. What we want you to do, the way Meisner described it in his book, which is a wonderful book for people that haven't read it, Sanford Meisner on Acting, is an absolutely miraculous book for actors to read, to get a sense of what
and any stage of their learning process.
Well, I think what it will do, it could be a little bit confusing for actors that have never taken the technique before. It could be potentially, but it still gives actors a sense of what the technique is about. The book that is like my Bible that I work from, basically, is Larry Silverberg's book, who studied with Sanford Meisner, called The Meisner Approach, which is a wonderful book. But both books are wonderful books to read. I always tell my students, whichever book they're reading at the time, to always come to me and ask me questions if there's something that they don't understand. But just to get back for a moment with the point of view exercise, what Meisner says in his book is that if you equate emotions with a river,
Yes.
and there's a boat floating on the river, which is the words, it's the emotions which give life to the words. It's what we call the inner life that gives life to how the words come out of your mouth. And it's really actions that provoke emotions. And Meisner and Ilya Kazan were in the group theater at the same time, and I'm currently reading a marvelous book on Kazan called The Master Discusses His Films. And it's a must read for anybody that's an actor or a director. They have to read this book. It's remarkable. But one of the things you find out about Kazan is how closely he worked in a Meisner-like way. And of course they were in the group theater at the same time, so that's not a surprise. But for example, Kazan never, ever, ever told his actors to play an objective, nor did he use the word feeling. He didn't talk about feelings because he knew, as a director, that if he spoke about feelings, it would make his actors tense up. And I do the same thing in my classes. I don't focus on feelings, I focus on behavior, which is the essence of Meisner's technique. So the root of all acting is in the reality of doing, is what Sandy said. The foundation of all acting is rooted in the reality of doing. So that's what we deal with. We deal with moment-to-moment, impulse-to-impulse behavior. Feeling will come. If I provoke you, you'll feel something. If we're working in a scene and I do something provocative to you, and we both have two opposite objectives, right? No conflict, no drama is the rule. So if you and I are playing a scene and you want one thing and what I want is diametrically opposed to what you want, we will experience emotion because we're both going after what we want with all our heart and soul. But our job as actors is to give to one another.
That's where the work, the technique that affects the dialogue is so dramatic. The director has a lot to do with it too. The director can pull that kind of thing from the actor, and especially if you want to create, like you say, to have drama, you need conflict. And some actors, I mean, it comes to mind, many years ago I had the privilege, and I say the privilege, I saw the Price. The name of the play was The Price.
Arthur Miller.
George C. Scott, Barry Sullivan, Colleen Dewhurst. And just real quick, Barry Sullivan was a very celebrated doctor. He moved from New York to L.A. George C. Scott was his brother who stayed back with his parents in New York. They didn't do very well, and Barry Sullivan came in when the father died and had to get back because his practice is in California. And eventually the two brothers get into a tremendous argument.